Hey guys, Shindig here. With the end of the first round of PTR, I was talking with a friend when he shared this image with me. Now, some of you may have already seen this, and credit to Discforge for putting this together. These graphs show the number of kills and wipes for all logged fights in ICC on the first round of the PTR. Now, there are a whole lot of talking points that can come out of this, but what I found interesting was how 0 guilds have killed Heroic Lich King on both 10 and 25 man. So this got me thinking, will Heroic Lich King be killed week 1 of ICC release? Now, in classic WoW, you might think, well, obviously it will be killed. Players are just so much better. And every other raid launch hasn't lasted more than a couple of hours. Which is true, however, we have gotten unkillable bosses before. Think back to the original release of 25-man XE hard mode. This fight used to have 47 million health and went unkilled for almost 2 weeks until Blizz took the nerf hammer and stomped it into the ground. So it could very well be possible that Heroic Lich King ends up being unkillable. But to better understand why, let's first look back at the history of the fight, specifically the 25-man version. I won't be covering the 10-man version in this video. Paragon's world first 25-man Heroic Lich King kill took place on March 26, 2010, exactly 52 days after the previous boss, Sindragosa, was killed. On top of that, the Lich King was only killed with the 5% ICC buff. Namely, all players in the raid had 5% increased health, healing, and damage dealt. Paragon managed to achieve this feat with much better gear than players in Wrath Classic will have access to. I say this because it took Paragon 52 days to kill the Lich King. That's 7 full weeks of heroic reclears to gear out their raid team. For comparison, players going into ICC Week 1 in Wrath Classic will be equipped with Phase 3 BIS at best. This being an assortment of Ulduar hard mode gear and TOGC heroic gear. Put into perspective, 25-man ICC heroic gear is 19 item levels higher than TOGC heroic gear, excluding the Tribute Cloak. Furthermore, and while not yet confirmed, it seems likely players in Wrath Classic will not have the support of the 5% buff Paragon formerly had. Hopefully this paints a clearer picture of how much of a handicap this imposes on Wrath Classic players when going for a week 1 kill, compared to the world first kill of the Lich King 13 years ago. Now, had this been the entire story, there would be no conversation, and the boss would be unkillable. However, there are 2 points that makes this a conversation worth having. The first point is that in original Wrath, raid teams had a limited number of attempts each week on Arthas, similar to what we see currently with Heroic Trial of the Grand Crusader. Raid teams can only send so many pulls before being locked out for the week. That said, as of the most recent ICC PTR, this attempt cap was present in Heroic Icecrown Citadel. The difference, however, is that through the PTR, raid teams have the ability to play on multiple characters to effectively surpass this limit. For example, a raid team that runs out of heroic attempts can easily copy characters over to the PTR and just clear the raid again. It may not be the most efficient use of time if the priority is to prog the Lich King, but the only constraint is time, which many of the top-end guilds will have quite a lot of over the course of multiple PTR sessions. Furthermore, many top-end guilds will utilize private servers to get further, uncapped practice on a similar version of the Lich King. All of this being something that raid teams in original Wrath didn't have access to. The second major point then is that World of Warcraft players now are magnitudes better than they were in original Wrath, and modern players have the advantage of information. Assuming the Lich King is released in Wrath Classic with all the same abilities and damage tuning as it was in its original state, players can prepare with this information ahead of time. So with these differences established, let's take a look at the numbers. A big assumption I'm going to make is that this encounter can be healed with 5 healers. I don't know if this is true with Phase 3 BIS gear. There isn't enough information from guilds progging this encounter to conclusively say one way or another. Conversely, it may prove to be the case that this encounter can be healed by fewer than 5 healers, at which point the DPS checks become more forgiving. But with that out of the way, the first DPS check we need to cross off is the Enrage Timer. The Lich King has just over 103 million health. The encounter has a 15-minute Enrage Timer, and the fight effectively ends when Arthas reaches 10% health, or 10.32 million. This means your raid will need to deal 92.88 million damage over 15 minutes. Assuming you run 2 tanks, 5 healers, and the rest DPS, note that I'll make this assumption throughout the rest of the video, this works out to 103,200 DPS split among 18 raiders, or roughly 5,700 DPS. Now this seems easily attainable, but this number is misleading, because there are several periods throughout the fight where players have forced downtime and cannot DPS the Lich King. For example, each phase transition lasts 1 minute, of which there are 2, and downtime off the boss is usually longer than that since this doesn't include the Lich King's travel time. But we'll keep the length at a minute and assume dots on the boss make up the difference. Then, in phase 3, there is the heroic only mechanic where Arthas sucks everyone into Frostmourne for about 50 seconds. Again, if we assume dots make up some of that difference, we'll consider it 45 seconds. Now, exactly how many times the raid will have their souls harvested and be sucked down into Arthas before the boss enrages depends on how quickly a raid team can push into phase 3. Using Paragon's world first kill as an example, they pushed into phase 3 with around 6 minutes left on the berserk timer, and had 4 harvest soul phases before they killed the boss. Using this kill as a threshold, these 4 submerge phases at 45 seconds per submerge imply 3 minutes of downtime. Putting it all together, that's 5 minutes of downtime over the course of the fight. The new DPS check then comes out to 92.88 million damage done over 10 minutes, or 154,800 DPS. Split among 18 DPS, that's 8,600 DPS per player, again excluding tank damage. This number is definitely still reasonable, but it assumes full single target on the boss outside of forced downtime, which isn't an accurate portrayal of how this encounter works. Namely, there will often be raging spirits alive coming out of the phase transitions, which raids will need to prioritize damage into before swapping single target damage back to the Lich King. Again, using Paragon's world first kill as an example, this amounted to about 20 seconds of time spent doing prow damage into the spirits over the Lich King during the first transition, then about 25 seconds on the second transition. Since Arthas is being cleaved during this time, we'll arbitrarily drop this number to 15 seconds and 20 seconds respectively. Furthermore, the raid needs to full-on swap DPS to val'kyr during phase 2 to prevent their raiders from being dropped off the platform. Paragon spent an average of about 25 seconds killing these adds per set in phase 2, over 5 sets before phasing the boss. Since dots are still ticking and Lich King will be getting cleaved during this time, let's say we drop this number to about 15 seconds of downtime on Arthas. Thus, between the val'kyr and raging spirits, this adds an additional 110 seconds of downtime. So now our DPS check looks like the following. 92.88 million damage done over 8 minutes and 10 seconds, or 190,000 DPS. Split among 18 DPS, that's 10,500 DPS per player, excluding tank damage. So we've concluded the average player needs to maintain just over 10,000 DPS during the active damage windows on the Lich King over the course of a 50-minute encounter. Although a little tight, I do think this is an achievable number for top-end raid guilds. So, does that mean 25-man Heroic Lich King is killable? Well, not exactly. While we've established the necessary active single-target DPS required to kill the Lich King, there are several other DPS checks within this Enrage window players will need to hit. The first real DPS check is pushing the boss to phase 2 before a third Shambling Horror spawns. Now, I'm assuming this is a necessary DPS check to kill the boss. In every Heroic Lich King video I've seen, this has been the case. Not doing this will mean you fall further behind, and succeeding in the later phases of this fight will become infinitely more difficult. To achieve this, the third horror spawns approximately 2 minutes and 25 seconds into the fight. And since we know the boss phases at 70% health, this implies 30.96 million damage must be dealt over 145 seconds. This works out to 214,000 DPS, or 11,900 DPS when split among 18 damage dealers. The off-tank won't contribute much while tanking Shambling Horrors, but if we generously assume the main tank does half the damage of an average DPS, this number drops to 11,540 DPS per damage dealing player. This is a very tight DPS check. WoW Sims has many classes DPS numbers for an encounter of similar length coming out to around this value with Bloodlust. That said, I believe this check is doable with Phase 3 Bis, Bloodlust, and slight class stacking. By which I mean, outside of your utility DPS players, fill the remaining spots with DPS classes that sim above this amount for a 145 second encounter. Classes like Unholy Death Knights, Arcane or Fire Mages, and Affliction Warlocks, to name a few. Then, we move on to the first transition damage requirement. There's about 10 seconds of downtime going into the transition before the first Raging Spirit spawns. 3 Raging Spirits spawn in intervals during this time, and based on the assumption made previously, players must kill Raging Spirits during the phase transition, plus 20 seconds after the transition ends. Raging Spirits have 4.2 million health. The first spirit spawns about 5 seconds into the intermission, with a new ad spawning roughly every 20 seconds. Your raid will need to DPS through these 3 ads in no more than 75 seconds from the moment they spawn. This will largely be full single target damage, with a little bit of cleave between the second and third ads. This implies 12.6 million damage must be done in 75 seconds, or 168,000 DPS. Split among 18 DPS players, and if we weigh in the tank damage, that's roughly 9,000 DPS per player. This check is much less demanding than the phase 1 push, but assuming the raid used Bloodlust and cooldowns on pull, this check may prove to be sneaky difficult. Classes with 3-minute cooldowns should have them come back up for this phase, but may opt to hold them until phase 2. And 2-minute cooldowns will have likely already been pressed a second time to beat the phase 1 push. Furthermore, coming out of the first phase transition, the phase 2 DPS check is extremely high, so raid teams may need their players to immediately swap to Arthas and lean on cleave damage to finish off the final Raging Spirit. Now, moving on to phase 2, your raid will be faced with the most difficult DPS check of the entire fight. That is, killing the val'kyr before they drop players off the platform, while still dealing sufficient damage to Arthas to phase him before the 6th set of val'kyr spawns. Similar to the case of the 3rd Shambling Horror, I haven't seen a successful heroic Lich King kill in which more than 5 sets of val'kyr ended up being killed. 3 val'kyr spawn every 45 seconds, picking players up and flying to the edge of the platform. They can be slowed, stunned, and cleaved down to delay them from dropping players. Using Paragon's kill as a baseline, assuming the raid can properly group up and slow the val'kyr, your raid must deal 4.5 million damage in about 25 seconds, or 180,000 DPS, and if divided among 16 players, that's 11,250 DPS excluding tank damage. Now, exactly what the DPS requirement will be to free players before they're dropped depends on which players are picked up. This value assumes 2 DPS and 1 healer are picked up. If 3 DPS are picked up, this number jumps to 12,000 DPS. On the other hand, Warlocks have the ability to portal back to the platform after being dropped by a val'kyr. So if one of your Warlocks gets scooped up, your raid can effectively ignore that ad, and the damage requirement drops dramatically to 7,500 DPS. While this is happening, you want to phase the boss before the 6th set of val'kyr spawns. Arthas enters his 2nd phase transition at 40% health. Since val'kyr spawn every 45 seconds, with the first set spawning roughly 20 seconds after the first phase transition, this means you need to deal slightly less than 30.96 million damage to the Lich King over 245 seconds. So in addition to dealing up to 12,000 DPS over 25-second intervals to the val'kyr when they spawn, or about 6,100 DPS per player for the phase, your raid also needs to do 30.96 million damage over 245 seconds, or 126,400 DPS to the Lich King, which is 7,000 DPS per player on the boss. Therefore, considering the necessary boss and val'kyr damage dealers will need to pull an average of about 13,100 DPS per player during this phase, or 12,900 DPS with tank damage. This is an incredibly high value, and assumes the worst possible RNG of 3 non-Warlock DPS players being picked up by the val'kyr for every set. But I also don't weigh in the loss in uptime on Arthas that occurs when players are picked up. So this value likely isn't that far off what the actual necessary DPS requirement would end up being. This result shows that phase 2 is an all-out DPS race. The saving grace here, and the reason this phase is possible at all, is that through correct positioning, this phase effectively becomes a 4-target cleave simulator for 25 seconds in 45-second intervals. Therefore, classes with high multi-target damage are able to pull much higher DPS values than they would in single target. Because of this phase's very high DPS requirement, and the RNG involved regarding which players get picked up, it's very likely raids will choose to hold Bloodlust for this phase, meaning raid teams will need to beat the first phase DPS check without Bloodlust. Now, there's one more DPS check I want to cover before I give my final thoughts, but know that phase 2 in particular leads me to believe this fight is not doable week 1 without ICC gear. For now, keep that in mind, but I'll come back to this point in more detail later. Once the boss gets to 40% health, the fight enters the 2nd phase transition. This time players need to contend with 4 adds and aim to have them dead with roughly 80 seconds of uptime. This implies 16.8 million damage must be done in 80 seconds, or 210,000 DPS. Split among 18 DPS, and considering tank damage, this number drops to something like 11,350 DPS per player. The second phase transition requires higher damage output than the first, because 4 adds spawn instead of 3. That said, in the case of the first phase transition, it's crucially important the last Raging Spirit dies before the first set of val'kyr spawns. In the case of the second phase transition, the 80 seconds of uptime is the time needed to kill the adds before the first set of vile spirits. The difference here is that vile spirits can still be correctly dealt with while a Raging Spirit is left alive. It's just more difficult to pull off because you won't have your off tank to help soak this first set of vile spirits. On normal, the second phase transition is likely where most guilds will press Bloodlust, because navigating vile spirits with a Raging Spirit still alive can be very dangerous. But guilds pushing for a week 1 heroic Lich King kill will likely come up with other ways to deal with it, meaning this particular DPS check may be less impactful. And once your raid has settled into phase 3, there are no remaining DPS checks apart from beating the Enrage Timer. So in summary, and loosely considering tank damage, we have the following values for necessary DPS checks per player. So this brings us back to the question, is heroic Lich King killable week 1? I believe the answer is no, at least not without ICC gear. Guilds that hope to have a shot at killing heroic Lich King week 1 will almost assuredly need to at the very least run several 10-man heroic ICC splits to gear out their players. Not only that, they also need to get lucky with their drops, such that they have enough leeway to both meet the necessary damage check and then kill the boss. I say this because as things currently stand, there is a limit to the number of heroic attempts that can be done. This means that even if a guild manages to successfully pull off several 10-man heroic ICC splits, and kit out their main 25-man team with enough gear to theoretically kill the boss, if the margin to achieve this is small, some guilds may just run out of pulls before they kill the boss. This is where luck plays a factor. The more gear you can get out of these 10-man splits, the larger the margin for error becomes, and the more likely a guild is to kill the Lich King within their remaining heroic attempts. With that said, there is one possible exception. One exception that may allow guilds to clear heroic Lich King week 1, or even day 1, without doing 10-man splits. And this will be raid teams that fill out all of their non-utility DPS spots with Unholy Death Knights. Not only are Unholy DKs currently the strongest DPS spec in the game, their multi-target damage profile through D&D and Pestilence might just be enough to meet the phase 2 DPS check. But we'll have to wait for the next PTR, or maybe even the live launch, to see if any raid teams attempt to pull this off. As an aside, it is worth noting that there remains the question of what Blizzard decides to do about the percent ICC buff that was originally in the game for Paragon's world first Lich King kill. Whether or not they choose to include it will almost certainly influence the likelihood of a week 1 kill. And that's it. I expect many high-end guilds to go in and get plenty of practice on the Lich King this upcoming PTR. So I'm sure we'll have a much better understanding of how likely a kill will be come launch once more raid teams have seen some practice with it. But until then, we'll have to wait and see. Thanks for watching.